Welcome to the Galloway Law Podcast. My name is Thomas Galloway. Today's guest is Keith Miller, professor of law at Drake Law School. One of his main areas of research is gaming law, so we spent a lot of time talking about the history of gambling in the U.S., casinos, and how online gambling is affecting the future of gaming law. If you enjoy this episode or any of the other episodes, please subscribe and share with a friend. It really does help. And now to the interview. Before we get into specifics about online gambling, I'd like to start with the general history in the U.S. of legality of gambling.
Well, gambling in the U.S., if historically, you really look at lotteries, because in colonial America, pre-revolutionary America, most of the states in New England had lotteries, and they used the lotteries to raise money. Some of the big universities now, Columbia University was in part founded with lottery money, and so they used the lottery money for public works and that sort of thing. They continued to do it after we became the United States and into the 19th century, but then gradually they came into disfavor because people thought they were corrupt, and just fewer states started allowing them as the states came into the Union. So that by the end of the 19th century, there was no lottery at all anywhere in the U.S. And not until 1964 did you have a lottery again, and now 44 states have lotteries. As far as other forms of gambling, legal gambling, then we always look at Nevada as a state, but Nevada has been off and on for many years. They had prohibited gambling. And then really I think 1931 is the date where they legalized gambling, regulated it, and since then they've flourished with that. Right. And then some form or another, about half the states have either casino gambling or tribal gaming, or as I say, 44 states have lotteries. Right. So it is very, very state to state, but the history of it in the U.S. is very reflective of how we have approach avoidance with gambling. It's very popular, people like to do it, but we're also concerned about the fact that it's a vice. Right.
So you can have casinos on Native American reservations, and I think I saw about 21 states allow for commercial casinos. Mm-hmm. And then riverboat, like gambling on riverboats. Are there any other places that casinos typically pop up?
Well, here in Des Moines, we have what is called a racino, which is taking a racetrack and a casino and putting them together. Okay. Because Prairie Meadows is the largest property here, largest gaming property here, started off as just a racetrack for thoroughbreds and for quarter horses. But they went out of business very quickly because there just wasn't the market to sustain it, and taxpayers in Polk County were really on the hook for bond payments that financed the building of Prairie Meadows. And someone came up with the idea of, well, how about if we take all that space that was created for people to watch horse races and we put slot machines in there. Right. And so that's what they did, slot machines and then table games. And now Prairie Meadows is by far just very, very, very profitable, and all the bonds were paid off. So many states also have that, what they call racino model.
Okay. So they have, the ones that are not on Native American reservations have some limits as far as the types of gambling they can have in those casinos?
It's regulated. All states will have a regulatory body, like in Iowa, it's the Racing and Gaming Commission, that develops regulations about types of games, how much people can bet, whether you can use mobile devices and that sort of thing.
Right. So in May, the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to only allow sports betting in Nevada. Could you give some more specifics as to what their reasoning was behind that?
It was somewhat of a historical accident that Nevada ended up as the only state where you could have sports betting.
Okay.
They had sports betting for many years, but it was never really very profitable because the taxes were too high.
Okay.
But then, again, in the 80s, it began to be more popular in Nevada, and other states wanted to get in on it. And in 1992, they passed this law, the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, which said, we're not eliminating sports betting, but meaning that Nevada could continue to offer sports betting, but no state can authorize sports betting into the future.
Okay.
And that's what the Supreme Court said was unconstitutional, was Congress, if it wants to regulate sports betting, it can,
Right.
because it would have the power to do that. But if it doesn't want to do it, they can't prohibit the states from regulating sports betting. That is what the court called commandeering the state legislatures, and that violates the 11th Amendment, which gives a considerable power to the states.
Okay. And since that ruling, what have we seen specific states? What actions have they taken? And what do you think we'll see in the future?
Well, immediately, New Jersey was the state that challenged the law. So they got going on it right away. Though they were beaten to the punch by Delaware. Delaware was the first state, other than Nevada. Delaware was the first state, then New Jersey, then you had Mississippi and West Virginia. Those 4 states got in right away. And now we have New Mexico has a tribal casino that is offering sports betting.
Okay.
And soon Pennsylvania and Rhode Island will have sports betting.
Okay.
And a number of states, including Iowa, will be considering whether or not we have sports betting in the state.
Okay. Back to the Native American reservations, how does regulation work with the casinos on those reservations? Do they do some of it themselves, or is it primarily a federal thing?
Indian tribes are sovereign nations. That's the view in our Constitution, that they're a sovereign nation, but they're what they call a dependent sovereign,
Okay.
meaning that the rights of Indian tribes can be determined by Congress.
Right.
And it is determined by Congress. So in 1988, Congress passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which goes by the name of IGRA, and it authorized tribes to offer gambling on their lands,
Right.
if the state in which the tribe's lands were located allowed gambling.
Okay.
It's a pretty technical law, but for all practical purposes, if a state has any form of gambling, then they have to at least let the tribes offer bingo games and things like that.
Okay.
If a tribe has casinos where they offer blackjack, slot machines, then they have to allow the Indian tribes to do that. They have to negotiate with the Indian tribes with reach a compact, an agreement that allow the Indian tribes to offer that form of gaming. So from a tribal perspective, it's very, very intrusive. They're told by the federal government and by the states what the limits of their gambling is. But the regulation of gambling itself is done by the tribe and by the National Indian Gaming Commission.
Okay. If you or I or somebody wanted to start a casino on a reservation, could they do that with permission from the tribe?
No.
Okay. That has to be started by someone in that tribe.
Well,
Or
when you Indian tribes, and usually the governing units are called tribal councils,
okay.
they would authorize someone on their land operating a casino,
Right.
and they could authorize practically anybody to do it,
Right.
but a person couldn't come onto their land without their authorization and do that.
Okay. So moving on a bit to online gambling. So Nevada legalized it in 2013, and in the paper it mentioned that they used a lot of their experience with brick and mortar casinos to inform the regulatory environment online. Was that the right approach, do you think, or would we be better off looking at the way online gambling was regulated in other countries?
Well, we're limited in the way that we can look to other countries,
Okay.
because we've got 50 states.
Right.
And in a country like, European country like France, if France decides we're going to allow internet gambling, then there's a governmental body that creates regulations and rules, and then it applies to everybody in the country.
Right.
In the U.S., it is determined state by state by state. So when Nevada came up with their initial regulations for internet gambling, internet poker, it wasn't internet gambling, it's just limited to poker.
Okay.
I think they were really trying to see, okay, how much demand is there for this?
Right.
Because it had to be just from within Nevada. And Nevada itself only has 3 million people. It's about the same size as Iowa. And it hasn't, internet poker has not been a big success in Nevada.
Right. Okay.
Now, other states, New Jersey has internet gambling, which is both internet poker and internet casino games. You can play casino games online,
Right.
As you can in Delaware. But some states, Pennsylvania, will go to that model very soon. But many states don't allow internet gambling. They just don't like the idea that people can gamble on the internet. And it's, in a way, very surprising, because that's the way, increasingly that's the way people are going to want to gamble, is they don't want to go necessarily to a casino. Or, in the case of Las Vegas, if people go to Las Vegas, a lot of it is just for the entertainment and the fun that is offered there, rather than it just being a casino. So the internet gambling issue is still very, very fluid.
Right. Okay. And the book that's referenced was split up into a couple sections, depending on the chapter, split up talking about, in part, the regulatory requirements around online gambling, and the other part about how to protect consumers, the gamblers in this situation. So starting with the regulatory requirements, it mentions the level of review as part of the licensing process, and which essentially the intensity of the process. Mm-hmm. Is that a concern when licensing online gaming businesses, is how in-depth the licensing process is?
I don't think the licensing process for online gambling is any more in-depth than for any other form of regulated gambling. When somebody wants a gaming license in a state, they say, we want to offer, they want to open a casino, build and open a casino. Then the scrutiny that they're given by a state is, they look at everything in that person's past.
Right.
Financial records going back to the time the person worked in a grocery store as a teenager. A spouse's financial records. They spare. I mean, it's an incredibly intrusive and very expensive process that the person has to pay for.
Okay.
For online gaming, the company wants to offer online games in Nevada or New Jersey or any place else. They're also going to be under great scrutiny. I mean, they're going to have to go through the same licensing process.
Right.
And they may not get a gaming license if they have a background that, if I can use an example, during the time that internet poker was very popular in the U.S., 2006, 7, 8, 9, there was a real question about whether or not internet poker sites were operating legally in the United States.
Okay.
And then the federal government kind of cracked down on a lot of that, both through federal law and also when they found that some of the internet sites, the poker sites, were not securing the money of the customers, keeping it separate. Some of those companies went out of business, but some of the people who were the principals in that company wanted to then start other poker sites or other internet sites. Mm-hmm. And in some states, there's this, in Nevada, this idea is, look, we're not going to license you because you, years ago, were operating an internet site and there were real doubts about whether it was legal.
Right.
So, you're not going to get a license. That's what they call the bad actor restriction.
Okay.
So, long story to it, but I don't think that the regulation of internet gambling is different, but it's not than casino games, land-based games, but it's not different as far as the scrutiny that's given to the people who are trying to offer it.
Okay. And what are some of the ways that we can prevent money laundering online?
Some of the same ways that we prevent it on land-based casinos, and that's just having, if it's a regulated casino, which is one of the problems with offshore casinos,
Right.
they're not subject or they don't follow these rules. But if it's regulated in the U.S., then an online casino has to follow the same rules that land-based casinos do
Right.
about reporting, with things like any transaction over $10,000, they have to file a currency transaction report with this called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network that's part of the Department of the Treasury. If they think that a gambler is doing something unusual, trying to make large deposits and withdrawals, then they have to file a suspicious activity report with FinCEN. So with internet gambling, I think many people, rather than being afraid of it, think that it's easier to prevent money laundering because anything that's done online leaves a trail.
Right.
You can delete anything you want, but there's going to be an electronic trail of where the money came from, where it went, and that's not always true when you're talking about stacks of $100 bills that people are exchanging.
Right. Yeah, I was going to move on to ask about the offshore unregulated providers. Yeah. How common is this, and is it an issue that we really should be concerned about?
There are a lot of them.
Right.
The ones that are now most prominent are the ones that offer sports betting.
Right.
And it would take nothing. I could, within 3 minutes, go online, open an account with an offshore sports book, fund the account through a credit card where the money was routed into a foreign country so that it doesn't look like it's going for gambling purposes. And it's redirected until it gets to the gambling operator, and then I could bet online on sports. And there are a lot of those companies out there, and with the legalization of sports betting in the U.S., the big challenge is how do you get people who are betting on sports on those sites to stop doing that and start betting on the regulated legal sites.
Right.
That's the fundamental challenge in regulating sports betting.
Right. Legalizing it, does that seem like the best way to get people off those other sites instead of trying to shut those down? Because I imagine that's a moving target that you're always chasing.
It is, and I think there's so many parallels to it. If they really wanted to shut down the market for people betting on sports with the offshore companies, they wouldn't focus as much on the companies as they would the gamblers.
Right.
They would start prosecuting people who were doing that. And that would be something that people go, oh my gosh. And now there's, somebody says, the offshore sports book I was using got shut down. I'm just, I didn't have much money in there. I got my money out of it, but I'm just going to go somewhere else.
Right.
You're at no risk.
Right.
If the federal government start going after people and saying you're in violation of federal law by gambling with this site, I think that would have an enormous impact. But they don't want to do that because it's really unpopular.
Right.
People think that it's overreaching to prosecute individual gamblers, and that's rarely done.
Right. So moving on a little bit to the consumers, the gamblers themselves, it mentions a couple of regulation models to protect consumers' money, one being the full reserve model and the other being a use of trust accounts. Could you explain a bit about both these approaches and if one of them is generally preferable?
I don't think that either one of them is regarded as better than the other.
Okay.
I think it's a matter of how regulators what the regulators are familiar with and comfortable with.
Right.
If in a particular state, regulators have a history of having money set aside in a particular way, they're going to want to do that with internet gambling just as they would with the casinos themselves. So I don't think there's anything really there that would, as a matter of public policy, that would drive regulators to go one path or another.
Okay. And it mentions about identifying problem gamblers and how that can be maybe a little difficult to do online. To brick and mortar casinos for a second, are they required to take action if they see a gambler that seems to be acting particularly irresponsible?
They are not allowed to allow people to gamble if the person's intoxicated.
Okay.
But other than that, or underage.
Right.
But other than that, their duty to intervene and tell somebody you're losing too much money is something that most regulators don't impose on them, because they view that as, it's an individual's choice.
Mm-hmm.
Now, most states have a process that they call self-exclusion, where a person will sign a document saying, I've got a gambling problem, and I hereby promise that I will not come onto your property and gamble.
Right.
And if I do, you can throw me out, you can arrest me for trespassing, and I forfeit any money that I win.
Okay.
Sign everything. And to some extent, that's helpful in people acknowledging, owning the problem they have, problem gambling. But many people disregard those self-exclusions, and they come back onto the casino grounds and gamble.
Right.
If the casino knows that somebody's on the self-exclusion list and they're gambling, then they have to get them off the property.
Okay.
But the problem with it is that there's no real way that they would find that the person is on the self-exclusion list. If you go to Prairie Meadows and you look like you might be close to 21 years of age, they will require identification. Mm-hmm. But they don't ask for identification to see if someone's on the self-exclusion list.
Right.
In that database. So someone could come back and gamble again, lose a lot of money, and they wouldn't be picked up in the self-exclusion process.
Right.
On the other hand, if they came back onto the property and hit a slot machine jackpot, save a couple $1,000s, then a jackpot like that would have to be paid by an employee. It wouldn't just come out of the machine.
Right.
And then when they ask the person for identification to pay them, they do run the identification through the database for self-exclusions, and they'll come back and with security and they'll arrest the person for trespassing, and they don't win the $2,000.
Right.
So if a person violates your self-exclusion and comes back and loses more, it's okay. If they come back and win, then they can get arrested. So it's a really the problem gambling issue is just a very difficult situation for everybody, and the measures that are taken, I think many people believe, are just not enough.
Right. So online it mentioned that operators can be set up with a notification if it seems like a gambler might have a problem. Is there any way to really ensure that they're actually taking action on those notifications?
I don't think so. I think most of the time it's they tell the gambler, okay, if you want to limit your losses in a particular day to $1,000, then we can put that in, and then you're limited to $1,000. And then if you want to change that, it takes a couple of days for it to take effect, because we don't want somebody to say, well, the heck with that, I want to gamble more. There are ways that we could limit the amount of money per bet that someone makes. Or we could have self-exclusions also with internet gambling. But whether that works or not, it's just hard to know.
Right.
Because if people have gambling problems and they're playing casino games or even sports betting, the social nature of the activity sometimes can temper the person's impulses to gamble. machine gambling, like slot machines, where it's a very solitary, in the zone sort of activity, or at home in the basement on your desktop where it's just you and the machine, then those solitary types of gambling, some people think that that's where you can really have problems that aren't identified.
Right, okay. And one of my final questions is, one of the additional chapters in the book mentioned that a proposal for an international convention on online gambling. What would be some of the primary benefits of that?
Uniformity on that, so that you didn't have a jurisdiction on being able to take advantage of weaker laws in another country, right. And just the uniformity of regulation, the sharing of information about cheaters. With sports betting, it would be great because then you could share information about game fixing and things like that.
Right.
But an international convention, I think, would have very modest goals because a lot of small countries make a lot of money
right.
from being a haven for online gambling.
Right.
There's one betting site that used to be called Bodog, and now it's called Bovada, Bovada, and it's www.bovada.lv. And many people, when they look at that, think, well, okay, that's based in Las Vegas. That's what that LV means. No, it's Latvia, that it's based in Latvia. And that's because Latvian government's not going to hassle them.
Right.
And they pay a lot of money in taxes to the Latvian government. Latvian government doesn't want to be part of some international convention that would eradicate that because they're not going to benefit from it.
Right.
So I think you'd have to have very modest goals for an international convention.
Okay. And to finish off, if someone wanted to start a casino, land-based or online, I'm thinking more about land-based right now, and the first step is a licensing process. Is that correct?
Well, the first step is seeing if you can get the financing for it.
Right.
Because in licensing, not only do they look at what a person's background is, criminal background and otherwise, but they're also very concerned about where are you getting the money to build this casino. You want to build a casino, and here's the plan that you've got for it. Where's the money coming from?
Right.
Because many of the old Las Vegas casinos were built on money that came from organized crime.
Right.
And the reason for that was banks wouldn't loan companies money to build casinos because they thought that, it was made the banks look like they were engaged in illicit conduct. So they went to the Teamsters Union and got the money that way. So in order to counteract that, all regulators say, before we get very far in the licensing process, we have to know that you've got financing from a proper source. But yeah, the licensing process, which can take a long time and is very expensive.
Right.
Very expensive. That's how it gets going.
Okay. And after that, what are the next couple steps?
Well, going all the way through the regulatory process, you get a gaming license for the entity.
Okay.
You get licenses for all of the principal actors in the company.
Right.
And then the licensing process, depending upon how high up the person is, will vary. If somebody's a bartender, then they're not going to put them through a really severe licensing process. But you get the people licensed that you need to have licensed while you're building the property. You think you're going to get your license and you've got the financing for it, and then they just set a start date for it.
Okay.
But it's a long process.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the time today. I
Sure.
appreciate it. Yeah.